For some of you, it was a bit of a challenge since we had an overflow situation on Monday, so we scheduled this to be offered a second time. So thank you so much for both your understanding on Monday and for your patience at waiting then till today. And I'm really delighted to be able to offer this talk again, which is entitled The Lasting Legacy of Pope John Paul II. So we're going to start with a little quiz here. Who can tell me who's in this photo here? I hope you can recognize at least one person with a little white beanie. Who would that be? Pope John Paul II. And who else might be in this photo?
Is that you?
Yes, actually that is me, and with my son. So this was in 1992 when my son was 5 years old and he's now 26. So it was a little while ago, but I really enjoy being able to show that photo because it gives you a little window into why I do what I do, which is that I am a speaker on Pope John Paul II, and particularly something called Theology of the Body, which we'll look at a little bit later in this talk. But this experience with him is directly linked to why I do what I do today. So when we first scheduled this talk, John Paul II had not yet been announced that John Paul II was going to be canonized. And then just about a week or 10 days ago, the announcement was made. So it really is very timely, this talk, given that he hopefully will be canonized by the end of this year, if not sometime soon. So I think it's a really appropriate time to look at what we could say may be his lasting legacy. I would also like to dedicate this talk to my mother, Theo Crabb, who, as many of you know, lived here at Wesley Palms for 20 years, and she passed into eternity just this last May. And it's from my mother that I've received my passion, both for my Catholic faith and for teaching. I'm sure many of you know she was a teacher, and so she has passed that legacy on to me. And so I would like to dedicate this talk to her. So if we're going to look at the lasting legacy of Pope John Paul II, I thought it would be good to at least start off with a definition of legacy. So I went to the Merriam-Webster online dictionary. It's what we all do now. We don't have to pull out the big dictionaries anymore. And there was a particular word in the definition that jumped out at me, and it's the word gift. So here's the first definition. A gift by will, especially of money or other personal property. A bequest. And then the second definition says something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor from the past. So what I want to do this morning for my talk is I'd like to combine the first and the second definition of legacy. And here's the definition I'd like to use this morning in relationship to Pope John Paul II. A gift transmitted by or received from a predecessor. And so in order to do that, what I want to do is look at 7 lasting gifts. Because a legacy is something that's lasting, and if we also look at a legacy as being a gift, then we could look at 7 lasting gifts of Pope John Paul II. Now there are many, many more, but our time is limited this morning, and so I just pulled out 7 of them. So gift number 1, re-landscaping the papacy. In other words, re-landscaping the role of the Pope and how people view the Pope. Pope John Paul II was elected Pope on October 16, 1978, and he passed into eternity on May 2nd, 2005. Now, that's a long time to be Pope. Over 26 years, 26 and a half years he was Pope. And so during that time, he really did change the way we experienced and understand the Pope. I'd like to say pre-John Paul II, basically the Pope remained pretty much in Rome. And there's an author, George Weigel, and he says that, in a way, the papacy could be viewed as the Pope was the CEO of Roman Catholic Church Incorporated. That's the way the papacy was viewed before John Paul II. But after John Paul II, the Pope is very much seen as a world figure, a world player, someone whom not only Catholics, but often non-Catholics pay attention to what he's saying and to what he's doing. So very much changed the way the world experienced the papacy. There's an author, his name is David Gibson, and he's written quite a bit about the papacy, and here's what he said about John Paul II. He, meaning John Paul II, broke out of the golden cage of the Vatican and its protocols, and took the papacy to the world, rather than expecting the world to follow the road to Rome. I think that's a really good description of how John Paul II changed the landscape of the papacy. Gift number 2, breaking the Italian mold. So John Paul II was not from Italy. Where was he from? He was from Poland. So he was Polish. He was born on May 18th, 1920, and his given name is Karol Wojtyła. And he was born in a small town in Poland called Wadowice. Just, I think it's about 30 miles, 50 miles outside of Krakow. So he was born in 1920. Who here was alive in 1920? I figured we had a couple, right? Normally I cannot ask that question and get any responses, but I figured here that was a valid question. So he was born in 1920. John Paul II did not have an idyllic childhood, which I think is a bit of a surprise to many people. He was the youngest of 3 children, and his elder sister died before he was born. His mother died when he was 8. His older brother died when Karol was 12. And so that left just Karol in the care of his father, who was a very, very devout Catholic and a former officer in the Polish army. They lived in a little 1-bedroom apartment behind the parish church. However, by the time Karol was 21, his father passed away. And so that meant he was an orphan. By the age of 21, an orphan and no siblings. That's pretty stark. Pretty stark. So at university in Krakow, Karol was very interested in philology. Now, notice I did not say philosophy. That would kind of be, I think, what most of us might expect to hear. But he was interested in philology, which is the study of language. And he was also very interested in drama. And he was part of an experimental theatrical troupe while he was at university. Well, when the Nazi occupation came in, it shut down the university in 1939. And in order to avoid deportation, he went to work in a quarry, and then he went to work in a chemical factory. However, and this is fascinating because it stays with Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, his whole life, his passion for drama. He kept alive by being part of an underground theater group that he helped to found called the Rhapsodic Theater. Now, it was illegal to perform Polish works of theater. It was considered subversive. So there was this small group that kept Polish culture and theater alive by gathering together, all the windows closed, had to have someone on the lookout to perform Polish theater works. And he also continued to write plays and poetry, which continued throughout his whole life. In 1942, Karol Wojtyła made a decision that we now know changed not only his life, but all of world history. It was in that year that he decided to enter the underground seminary in Krakow, because it was illegal to study to be a Catholic priest. But he felt God calling him out of the theater and into priesthood. And so on November 1st, 1946, he was ordained to the priesthood. And after that, his cardinal sent him to Rome to study for his doctorate in theology. And so he had the opportunity to really encounter the broader church and the broader world by being in Rome. There is so much that we could say about Father Wojtyła. His passion for the outdoors. He was a great outdoorsman. It's so fun to look up photos of him on the internet, and you see him skiing, you see him kayaking. There's a very famous photo where he's shaving out in the wilderness. But also notice what else is in this photo. Lots of young people. He loved to spend time with young people, and because it was illegal to teach them the Catholic faith, he would take them away on camping and kayaking trips. And that's where he would teach them the faith. And they would have these discussions about life and about marriage and about what it meant to be a human person and truth and culture. We could talk about that. Or we could talk about his trajectory from parish priest to archbishop to cardinal. All of this under communist rule. But we don't have time for that. So what it will need to be this morning is simply the backdrop for what happened on October 16, 1978, when the cardinals of the Catholic Church elected Karol Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II. He was the 264th successor to the Apostle Peter. But what is most interesting is he was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. That's really a long time, which is why I think we can say he broke the Italian mold. It had been 1523 since we had had a non-Italian pope, and he was the first pope from a Slavic country. To me, what's just really heartening is that we see how in electing a non-Italian pope, the door was thrown open wide to be able to consider calling men from other countries to be pope. John Paul II said that when he was elected pope, the cardinals of the Catholic Church had called him from a faraway country. Well, we have seen this in the two popes after John Paul II. Pope Benedict XVI was from Germany, and our current pope, Pope Francis, is from Argentina. And so we really begin to see this breaking out of the Italian mode. Gift number 3, the globe-trotting pope. Pope John Paul II made more foreign trips than all previous popes combined. Wow. You add up 264 of them, and none of them made as many trips as he did. He traveled to 130 countries during his papacy, logging more than 725,000 miles. Now, I was trying to put that into something that perhaps we could wrap our mind around. And so I looked up how far it is from San Diego to Rome. And so 725,000 miles is essentially 117 one-way trips between San Diego and Rome. Anyone here traveled to Rome? It's kind of a long trip, isn't it? So imagine doing that 117 times, or it's approximately 3 times around the globe. So he was very definitely a globe-trotting pope. It has been said that he has been seen in person by more people in history than any other person. It's estimated that he has been seen by 150 million people in person, not on TV, not on the internet, but in person. Now, as part of this globe-trotting legacy that he has left us, John Paul II established International World Youth Day in 1986. So International World Youth Day occurs every 2 or 3 years, and it's a time when the Pope gathers in a major city around the world. For instance, it's been in Manila, it's been in Paris, it's been in Toronto, Canada. And so he gathers with however many young people would like to come and be with him, and they spend 2 or 3 days together in this wonderful dialogue. And what is so appropriate is, as a matter of fact, right now, July 26, 2013, World Youth Day is going on at this very moment in Rio de Janeiro. How great, huh, for the timing of this talk. It's the 12th World Youth Day. And again, perhaps some of you have already seen on the news some of the video footage of the Pope arriving, and they're expecting over 1 million young people to join him. So through World Youth Day, John Paul II changed the way young people experienced and looked at the papacy, because he reached out to them directly. He wanted to be with them personally. It wasn't good enough for him to be in Rome. Remember, he's an actor. And one understands it's so different live, isn't it? When you see a live performance as compared to when you see a video, he knew the importance of presence. And so he went to where the young people were, and they came to where he was. And so he could have the opportunity to speak to them directly about the challenges they face. Do you think young people today have a few different challenges than when you were 19, 20?
Oh, yeah.
Has the world changed a little bit? It's changed even since I was a young person. And so John Paul II recognized this, and he made it a point to speak directly to them in language they could understand, to be a spiritual father that they could identify with. I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that John Paul II changed how young people viewed the Pope. And as the result of that, part of his lasting legacy is the number of young men and women who have entered the religious life. It is amazing how vocations to the priesthood and religious life have, we can't quite say skyrocketed, but we can certainly say have increased dramatically by those who were touched by Pope John Paul II. Gift number 4, a Jewish heart. I'm really partial to this one because it strikes me very, very deeply. So John Paul II, growing up in Poland, was an athlete. He loved to play soccer. And in his town, there was a soccer team composed of Jewish boys and one composed of Catholic boys. And frequently, when the teams would play, he would volunteer to go play on the Jewish team so that it would even out the teams. And so even as a young boy, he had wonderful friendships with Jewish people. On October 13th, 1986, John Paul II literally made history. Because on that day, he was the first pope known to officially visit the Great Synagogue in Rome. It was really quite an event, and he was welcomed to thunderous applause by the 1,000 people who were present in the synagogue. I wanted to look something up that wasn't necessarily a Catholic quote on this topic. And so I did a nice internet search on John Paul II and the Jewish people. And in the Jewish Virtual Library, it states this about John Paul II. That John Paul II warmed relations between the Vatican and Israel, which had been frayed for nearly half a decade. No pontiff had ventured into the Holy Land since Pope Paul VI visited for just 11 hours in 1964. In 1993, John Paul II agreed to the fundamental agreement between the Holy See and Israel, establishing diplomatic relations between the two states. So he had a Jewish heart. He harbored a very, very special place for, as Catholics like to say, our elder brother in the faith. March 21st through 26, 2000, John Paul II visited the Holy Land for 6 days. And as part of that visit, he visited the Western Wall. And as many of you are probably aware, it's a custom to leave a note or a letter in the Western Wall, which is what we see he's doing here. And in that note, he asked forgiveness for all those who had caused suffering to the Jewish people. He held them very closely in his heart. If perhaps you, like me, are interested in this relationship between John Paul II and the Jewish people, there is a wonderful exhibit called A Blessing to One Another that chronicles this relationship. You can find out more about it on the internet at www.blessingexhibit.org, or the simplest way, just do a YouTube search on John Paul II and Blessing to One Another, and something will come up. So I encourage you, and if you ever have the chance to see it in person, it sometimes travels. Its permanent home is Cincinnati, Ohio. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful exhibit. So gift number 5, I think perhaps one of the most intriguing, it's toppling communism. So I went to Wikipedia, not exactly your famous Catholic source, and I looked up John Paul II and communism, and here's what it said. John Paul II has been credited with being instrumental in bringing down communism in Central and Eastern Europe by being the spiritual inspiration behind its downfall and catalyst for a peaceful revolution in Poland. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty amazing statement. To say that one person had a very significant influence in the toppling of communism. And yet Wikipedia isn't the only one who has that opinion. Catholic historian George Weigel, who I mentioned briefly a little bit earlier, has written a fabulous book entitled The End and the Beginning. And in this book, it reads part of it almost like a spy novel. Now, it's pretty thick, but if you're interested particularly in this relationship between John Paul II and communism, and how the Communist Party and the KGB tried to discredit John Paul II and tried to bring him down even from the time that he was elected archbishop. So it didn't start just when he was pope. It preceded that. And George Weigel notes that as pope, when he would visit Poland, he didn't criticize communism directly. John Paul II was not interested in provoking a violent revolution. Instead, he knew how to speak to the heart. And so what he did is, rather than criticizing communism directly, he preached about human dignity and the triumph of culture and truth over human political systems. And that is what eventually helped to dismantle communism. There's a Catholic writer and editor whose name is Joseph Boughton. Now, I have provided for you, when you leave, if you would like, an article that he wrote entitled John Paul the Great, in which he goes through a whole list of John Paul II's accomplishments and much more than what we can do in this short time here, but I thought you might be interested in it, so feel free to pick one up when you leave. I want to quote just a little bit from that article where he talks about John Paul II's relationship and communism. He says on November 13th, 1979, now remember John Paul II was elected in 1978, so just a little bit after, a year after he was elected, the Central Committee in Moscow approved a KGB plan entitled Decisions to Work Against the Policies of the Vatican in Relation with Socialist States. So already he was on their radar screen as a communist, as a threat to communism, I think is the best way to say it. How many of you here remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? Yes, lots of you. Again, it's so great to be able to ask that in this kind of context because many people don't even know it happened or existed, but it was in the early 1960s. And as you know, what happened at that point in time is it was discovered that the Soviets, that there were missiles in Cuba poised to perhaps be launched against other parts of the world. Well, I think we can see something similar was happening between John Paul II and communism. That unbeknownst to the rest of the world, very early in John Paul II's papacy, that the showdown between John Paul II and communism was already occurring. So I want to continue to quote from this article. At the end of 1980, worried by the Polish government's inability to control the independent labor union Solidarity, because that was the labor union that had been formed in order to try to resist communism. The Russians prepared an invasion to save socialist Poland. 15 divisions, 12 Soviet, 2 Czech, and 1 East German were to cross the border in an initial attack, with 9 more Soviet divisions following the next day. So they were prepared to invade Poland. On December 7th, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Dr. Brzezinski, called from the White House. Now, listen to who he called. Called from the White House to tell John Paul II what American satellite photos showed about troop movements along the Polish border. So, kind of similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And on December 16th, the Pope, John Paul II, wrote Leonid Brezhnev a stern letter invoking against the Soviets the guarantees of sovereignty that the Soviets themselves had inserted in the Helsinki Final Act as a way, they thought, of ensuring the communist permanent domination of Eastern Europe. Already caught in the Afghanistan debacle and fearing an even greater loss of international prestige and goodwill, Brezhnev ordered his troops home. Have any of you ever heard about that incident? I never had, and I've done quite a bit of reading about John Paul II. It wasn't until I was, doing my research for this talk that I came across that. That's pretty striking, don't you think? That in 1980, one letter from Pope John Paul II caused the Soviets to withdraw their troops and therefore not invade Poland. Cardinal Luis Aponte Martinez, who was present at the conclave that elected John Paul II, and who was later then Bishop Emeritus of Puerto Rico, and who accompanied John Paul II on many of his trips to Spanish-speaking countries, I think captured the spirit of John Paul II perfectly when he said about John Paul II, he was not afraid of anything. Matter of fact, sorry, a little insert here. John Paul II's favorite phrase was, "Be not afraid." Be not afraid. And why I love this quote is because it shows how he incarnated it himself in his own life. So he was not afraid of anything, and whatever he had to say, he said it. He went to Cuba, and he was not afraid of Fidel Castro. He went to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and he was not afraid of the dictatorship there. He spoke his heart. And that leads us to gift number 6. John Paul II's pen was mightier than the sword. John Paul II left us words, millions of them. During his pontificate, he released 40 official major papal documents, and he released 45 less formal documents, what are called apostolic letters. He released 5 books, and then of course there are thousands of addresses, homilies, Wednesday audience, World Youth Day talks. So we have millions of words from John Paul II. One of those collection of words of his is something entitled Theology of the Body. So now please notice, it is this little book here. So it's not exactly your light bedtime reading. And although it is referred kind of on the popular level as Theology of the Body, notice that its formal title is Man and Woman, He Created Them. So there are many of us who anticipate that this work of his will be significant, not just for decades, but for centuries to come. Because in it, he really does something new in terms of looking at the human person and the dignity of the human person. So in the next part of this talk, I'm going to do a very brief part about John Paul II's theology in order to point out one of John Paul II's roles in history. After all, he was a theologian. And so while he also operated on the world stage, which is what we've looked at so far, he also wrote and spoke as a theologian. And so I think it would be a bit of an omission if we didn't at least look at one little part of what many people continue to be one of his most significant theological works. It would be as if I gave a talk on Karl Marx and looked at his political philosophy. I mean, that's part of Karl Marx's legacy to us in history, is his political philosophy. So too, part of John Paul's legacy to us is his theology. And so because this happens to be my specialty, it would make most sense that we take just a little bit of time to look at theology of the body. And that leads us to gift number 7, the Pope of the Body. So obviously this is probably my favorite gift, because it's the one that I spend the most time on, but also because I think it gives us an opportunity, again, just to look at ourselves and the world and creation in a new way. Now, in Theology of the Body, John Paul II is going to draw from the Bible as a Catholic theologian because he found a great deal of inspiration from there. Now, perhaps for some of you, that's not a source of inspiration for you, drawing from the Bible. But I hope that at least you can see in this talk, as we've looked at his significance in history, this other dimension of his significance in which he drew inspiration from the Bible. So here we go, Theology of the Body. So for many people, putting theology and body together is kind of like an oxymoron, right? It's two things that don't go together. And in fact, before John Paul II, no one had ever really put those two words together before. Remember, John Paul II is a playwright, he's a poet, he's a writer. So he wasn't afraid to create and to invent new ways of saying things. And theology of the body is one of those. So putting theology and body together would kind of be like saying, I'm a vegetarian and I love to eat meat. Doesn't quite go together, does it? Or saying that I'm from Kansas and I love to surf. Right? It's a little hard to learn how to surf if you live in Kansas because it's landlocked. So for many people, when they hear theology and the body together, it's kind of like two things that don't go together. But for John Paul II, they absolutely went together. So let's see how. So John, if you would be so kind as to come up here for a moment. You'd be so kind? Yes, please. You can get your power working. Whoops, without blowing up the place.
1 second.
Okay. 1 second. 1 second's up. So I looked for you on Monday and you weren't there, so I'm so happy you're here today. I know. Okay, so John, I have a knife here. What's the purpose of this knife?
To cut something.
Great. So John, if I wanted to use this knife according to its purpose, can you show me how I might use it?
Sharp edge of the blade down.
Right. And what might I cut with it?
Meat.
Great answer. Wonderful. So if I wanted to use this knife according to its purpose, I might butter bread, I might cut meat. John, can I use this knife contrary to its purpose? Maybe I should go on this side so you can all see what I'm doing, right? John, can I use this knife contrary to its purpose?
I wouldn't today, no. Not today.
He says I wouldn't today. What do you all think? Can I use this knife contrary to its purpose? What do you think, Barb? Of course I can, but I'm not going to because John's my friend over in the courtyard, so, and I would never hear the end of it. Thank you so much, John.
You're very welcome.
Okay, round of applause for John. Be not afraid. So when we talk about a knife, it's very obvious what a purpose of a knife is and what John is hoping the purpose of that knife is not this morning. But the question that I want to look at, and the question that John Paul II wanted to look at, is what's the purpose of the body? Is the purpose of the body just to be born, to eat, drink, exercise, and then die? I'm so happy some of you said no. Or is there perhaps a deeper dimension to the body? That's exactly what John Paul II wanted to look at, this deeper dimension. So let's look at this term theology of the body, since John Paul II invented it. So theology is the study of what? What do we study in theology?
God.
Exactly, we study God. But you know what? We can't go up to heaven and study God directly. We can only study God by how he reveals himself. So that means theology is really the study of how God reveals himself. And body doesn't mean the hummingbird body or the cheetah body. It means the human body. So if we put all of that together as a term, then theology of the body means the study of how God reveals himself through the human body. But I think that's rather cumbersome. If people said to me, well, Katrina, what do you speak on? And I said, oh, I speak on theology of the body. And they said, well, what's that? And I'd say, oh, it's the study of how God reveals himself through the human body. So here's my shorthand definition. The body reveals God. That's what theology of the body means. The body reveals God. Okay, so let's try a little experiment here. I'm going to say theology of the body, and I want you to say the body reveals God. So here we go. Theology of the body means? I know you can do much better than that. Here we go. Theology of the body means? Exactly, the body reveals God. So every time you hear theology of the body, what are you going to think? The body reveals God, exactly. So I have some mountains here. If I cover them up, can you still see them? How? Exactly, in the reflection. You see, we can't see God directly, but we can see him in each other. We can see him through our bodies. This is why you are given a body, is so that you can reflect God, so that you can reveal God, because we cannot see him directly. So this is exactly what John Paul II wants to unveil in theology of the body. That the body revealing God is what John Paul II wants to explore. And the way he explored it was by giving a series of 133 Wednesday audiences in Rome from September 1979 to November 1984. So very early in his papacy, he began this series of his Wednesday audiences, and they've been collected in this rather big book here called Theology of the Body. So what I wanted to do this morning is look just briefly at the structure so that you have a sense of what theology of the body is. So just like the Bible has two halves, so too theology of the body has two halves. So I happen to be an athlete. Many of you know that I love to swim. You've seen me here swimming quite a bit. So we could take a football field. Can we divide it in half? Sure, where? At the 50-yard line. Don't you love visuals? Aren't they just so helpful? I mean, you may forget everything I've said, but you'll remember, okay, I remember she put a football field up and divided it in half. Okay, so the first half of theology of the body, John Paul II entitles The Words of Christ. And the second half he entitles The Sacrament, meaning the sacrament of marriage. So the first half is divided into three. He calls it a triptych. So triptych is a three-paneled altarpiece or painting. So too, the first half of theology of the body has three parts or three panels. And the first panel is who we are before original sin. So life in the beginning. The second panel is who we are after original sin. And then the third panel is who we will be forever in heaven. And then the second half, entitled The Sacrament, has two panels. So that means the fourth panel, I know it's hard to read there, is on the sacramentality of marriage. So it looks much more intently at marriage itself. And then the very last panel are John Paul II's reflections on Humanae Vitae. So Humanae Vitae was an encyclical, so an official writing, released by Paul VI in 1968. That's often been called the birth control encyclical, and it caused quite a storm in the Catholic Church. And really, it's more appropriate to refer to it as the responsible transmission of human life. And so because it's been so often misunderstood, John Paul II wanted to take another look at it. And so that's what he does to wrap up his theology of the body. So this morning, all I want to do is just give us a taste. So we're just going to look very, very briefly at part of this first panel, because in it, like a good philosopher and theologian, he sets the groundwork. He gives us the foundational principles on which he's going to build everything else. So that's how we'll finish the talk up this morning. It's just looking very briefly at this panel in theology of the body. So John Paul II begins with the words of Christ on divorce. Okay, so let's think about it for a minute. If you were going to begin 133 short lectures on the meaning and purpose of the body, would you start with divorce? I wouldn't. And yet John Paul II understands that marriage and the marital relationship is one of the most critical paths of all human relationships. And if we don't understand marriage, then we won't be able to understand life or the human person. This is why marriage is so critical, because it's a window. Again, it's a reflection of a bigger reality. So John Paul II begins with Christ's discussion with the Pharisees. They come to Jesus and they say, Moses allowed us to give our wives a writ of divorce. But what do you say? They're trying to trap him. And Jesus' response is, it was for your hardness of hearts that Moses allowed divorce, but from the beginning it was not so. In other words, God's original design and intention was different. And so what John Paul II does is he begins with the words of Christ, but then what he does is he launches back to the beginning, back to Genesis 1 and 2, to look at God's original design for us. So let's do that. Let's go back to the foundational scripture verse for theology of the body, Genesis 1:27. I would imagine some of you are familiar with it. It says, God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So that's fabulous that we're made in God's image and likeness. But how? What does it mean to be made in his image and likeness? That's exactly what John Paul II wants to continue looking at. And to do that, he moves on to Genesis 2. And in Genesis 2, Adam is created first. I brought Adam with me today. Here he is. Adam is created first in Genesis 2, and Adam has a problem. Who remembers? What's Adam's problem? Exactly, he's alone. So Adam's problem is in Genesis 2 is that he's alone. But if we think about it, eventually he's not alone, because God creates the stars and the trees and the animals, and they're the angels. And yet Adam experiences himself as alone, because there's not another creature who images God by being both body and spirit. Or we could say by being both body and soul. Do you remember how earlier in Genesis 2 it talks about how God created Adam from the clay of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life? That shows us that as human persons we're made of these two elements, that we're body and spirit, or body and soul. And there's no other creature who images God in the same way. The animals don't image God by being both body and spirit, because animals are only what? They're only body. They're only material. And the angels don't image God by being both body and spirit, because they're only what? Spirit. They're immaterial. Can you see that angel up there? I hope not. So in all of creation, only human persons image God by being both body and spirit. So I think many of you know the story. God takes Adam and he puts him to sleep. And from his side he takes a rib. And when he wakes up, he sees Barbie, right? No, of course not. Who does he see? He sees Eve. And listen to what Adam says. So for me as a woman, these are some of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. Adam says, this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, because from man this one, for out of man this one has been taken. In our culture, we have a very popular saying. Have you ever heard this saying? Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. It's pretty popular. Well, you know what? Scripture just showed us something very different. Scripture just showed us that men and women come from the same body. See, this is the meaning of Eve being taken from the side of Adam. If men were from Mars, God would have taken a little piece of Mars and formed it into man. Women were from Venus, a little piece of Venus, and formed it into a woman. But instead, he takes a rib from the side of Adam and forms it into a woman. This tells us that men and women come from the same body, and as a result, we share the same nature. Human nature. And because of that we share the same nature, a new possibility exists, one that never existed before. And Genesis 2:24 tells us exactly what this new possibility is. It says, this is why a man will leave his father and his mother and unite to his wife, and the two will be one flesh. Okay, so the hardest question of the morning. Who could tell me, what's that a description of? Begins with an M. What is it? Marriage. Exactly. So we see from the beginning that God has a design for marriage. And the design for marriage is union. This is beautiful. This is what marks marriage and sets it apart from any other relationship, is the fact that the man and the woman can give themselves to each other totally. They can enter into union. This is why a man shall leave his father and mother and unite. Some of the other verses, scripture translations say, cling or cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. You see, when Adam was alone, no possibility for union existed, right? Couldn't enter into union with a hippopotamus, a giraffe, an angel. Doesn't work. But once Eve is created, everything changed, because now the possibility for union and communion exists. Here's what John Paul II says in Theology of the Body. He says, man, meaning the human person, becomes an image of God, not so much in the moment of solitude as in the moment of communion. In other words, Adam, the human person, images God not so much when he's alone as when he's in relationship. So I love giving this talk here at Wesley Palms. Why? Because you understand instinctively that we're made for relationship. I mean, think of the beauty of Wesley Palms. Think of, in some ways, why it is so wonderful to live here. Because you don't have to be isolated. I mean, it's been such a privilege for me this summer. Many of you know, usually I fly in, I'm here 1 or 2 days, and then I'm out. But this summer I had the privilege of being here almost 6 weeks. And it's been such a joy because I've been able to actually get to know some of you personally, to eat with you and to have conversations with you, to be in relationship with you, to develop a friendship. This is what the Bible is talking about, that we're made for relationship. And it has to do with who God is. So as Catholics, as Christians, we believe God is not solitary. In other words, he's not sitting up in heaven all by himself. We believe that God has revealed himself as a Trinity. So what does it mean to say God is a Trinity? Does it mean that he's a shamrock? Well, every March, what's the date? Every March 17th, right? All the shamrocks come out. Does it mean that God's a shamrock? Not quite. Or how about that God is an old man up in heaven with a long white beard? When I ask people often to close their eyes and just picture God in their minds, this is the most common picture that pops into people's minds. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm made in God's image and likeness, it just doesn't quite work for me to think I'm made in the image and likeness of an old man with a long white beard. It doesn't help me understand who I am. Or another image that's often used to represent God, an old man, a young man, and a bird. See, we're visual people. We need to somehow have some kind of concept of what it means that God's a Trinity. So here's the way that I like to describe God as Trinity, drawing from the language of Theology of the Body. To say God is Trinity means the Father pours himself out in gift to the Son. And the Son pours himself out in gift to the Father. And the Holy Spirit bursts forth as the fruit of their self-giving love. Here's the way I like to summarize this. Who is God? God is a union and communion of fruitful self-giving love. It's a beautiful description, at least for me, much better than a shamrock or an old man with a long white beard. God is a union and communion of fruitful self-giving love. So too, as human persons, made in the image and likeness of a Trinitarian God, we too are created to live in a union and communion of fruitful self-giving love. This is the great gift of living at Wesley Palms, is that you have it just right here at your fingertips. The opportunity to live in union and communion in fruitful self-giving love to your neighbors, even to the staff. The staff lives in union and communion with you. So you're able to live Theology of the Body right here. John Paul II summarizes all this in another one of his writings entitled On the Dignity and Vocation of Women. And there he wrote, to say that man, and again he means the human person, is created in the image and likeness of God, means that man is called to exist for others, to become a gift. Here it is. Here's the meaning and purpose of your body. This is why you were given a body, so you could reflect God, because who is God? A union and communion of fruitful, self-giving love. And so we're created to be a gift, to offer that gift of self to others. The purpose of the body is very simple. It's to be a gift, to reveal a Trinitarian God by giving ourselves away in love. Because this is what we believe has been happening in the Trinity for all eternity. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit giving themselves away to each other in love. So the lasting legacy of Pope John Paul II, well, one way we could say is, as we have this morning, is that he left us 7 gifts. So who remembers what the first one was? The little bulldozer. Re-landscaping the papacy. The second one? Breaking the Italian mold. The third one? The globe-trotting Pope. The fourth one? A Jewish heart. The fifth one? Toppling communism. The sixth one? His pen was mightier than the sword. And this last one, the Pope of the body. And that's my hope, that we'll all go forth from here understanding even more deeply not only John Paul II's lasting legacy in terms of history and the global world, but his lasting gift to each and every one of us, is that to remind us that we were and are created to be a gift, and that we make this gift so that others can see God through us, because it is the body that reveals God in his Trinitarian love and mystery. Thank you so much for being here this morning.